All right, here we are again. We are now moving into how your body actually responds to pathogens and stuff like that. And so we're going to be getting into immunity, all right, and what that means. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take this topic. It's kind of a big topic. I'm going to break it up again into 2 videos, right? So there's 3 videos overall. I didn't mention that in the first video. Probably because I hadn't decided that until I made this one. But that's fine. So we're going to talk about immunity. This first one I'll introduce immunity, and then we'll get into one of the 2 different types of immunity, okay? Which has to do with how your body responds, what cells are activated, and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and talk about that for a second. So we're talking about immunity within your immune system. This is your ability to resist infection, okay, and disease, which could be caused by abnormal cells in your own body, for example. Now, the immune system, as a system, is all of the body cells that are involved in the production of immunity. So, and are sort of part of the response, right? So your immune system has elements of the integumentary system, the circulatory system, the lymphatic system, the digestive system, honestly, is also part of it. And so it's very broad. It covers a whole lot of different things within the function of resisting infection. Immunity is your ability, or an organism's ability, to resist infections and defend against pathogen infective organisms, damaging substances like toxins, heavy metals, things like that. Resistance is your ability to maintain immunity. So resistance is your ability to maintain your body's ability to resist pathogen invasion, basically. So if your resistance is low, that's like a memory thing. Your immune system basically forgets that it's immune to something. And that's why, like periodically with certain vaccines, for example, you have to get boosters and stuff like that. Your immune response is your body's reaction to pathogens, okay? And there's 2 main immune responses. So, or 2 types of immunity, right? So how your body reacts to pathogens and stuff like that, like bacteria. Okay, so there's 2 types. There is innate immunity, also known as nonspecific. Now, you need to know both of these words. I will typically use innate immunity, but you also need to know that it's nonspecific. And the reason why it's nonspecific, also known as innate. So innate, you're born with this immunity. As babies, we all have the same immune response, right? And so it works the same way regardless of the pathogen that is detected, right? Against poisons and abnormal cells and stuff like that. It's going to do the same response. Now, it's fast and it's broad spectrum, not always that effective. Now, what is much more effective is adaptive immunity, also known as specific immunity, and this protects against specific pathogens, right? So chickenpox versus smallpox versus streptococcus, right? Those are 3 different immune responses to those specific pathogens. And this is determined by the activities of specific lymphocytes, which I'll get into in a lot greater detail in the 3rd video in this series. Now, your specific immunity, or your adaptive immunity, develops after exposure to hazards. So you have to be exposed to the chickenpox virus in order to develop an immunity to chickenpox. That's where the vaccine comes in. Now, back in my day, you'd got chickenpox. There wasn't a vaccine for it. And in my parents' day, so like maybe your grandparents or your great-grandparents, depending on where you're at in the family tree, they did the same thing with measles. There wasn't a measles vaccine. You just went. My grandmother would always tell me about how she sent all of her kids, my dad and my aunt and uncle, to measles parties. Somebody down the block would have measles. All right, let's go give them measles, get it out of the way, because then they never got it again. Then there was a vaccine for that. Now there's a vaccine for chickenpox. So y'all, hopefully, if you're watching this, you didn't have to experience the supreme discomfort of chickenpox. But you have to be exposed to it. If you're never exposed to chickenpox, you'll never develop an immunity to it. And if you go back and look at history and stuff like that, with European settlers coming into North America, there were a lot of problems. And one of the main ways that the Native American populations, the indigenous populations, were so severely decimated is because European settlers brought with them diseases that they had no immunity for. And during their time of exposure, a lot of them got sick. Smallpox is a devastating illness and wiped out huge swaths of the indigenous populations of North America, basically laying the land open for colonization. And there's a lot of really interesting articles and stuff and books to read that I'll put a link in the description. There's one particular book, but I can't think of it off the top of my head, that is really, really good. It's a really interesting read that sort of looks at how disease has factored into global expansion of various tribes and stuff like that. But anyway, I got off topic. I'm sorry. Talking about immunity and stuff like that. So we're going to be focusing for this video, we're going to be focusing on innate immunity, your innate defenses. Remember, these are non-specific, so they're going to do the same thing, whether it's streptococcus or HIV or cancer or something like that, right? And so anything that is recognized as foreign is going to be blocked. And so it can't tell streptococcus from E. coli, from varicella, from rotavirus, stuff like that, right? It's going to have all the same defense. So innate defenses include physical barriers like your skin, your hair, epithelial layers of internal pathways like your lungs, secretions that flush away materials like mucus in your nose and your throat. Sweat also does that. It helps remove pathogens off of your skin. Urine does the same thing. It helps. One of the functions of urine, and we'll talk about this in a couple of units, is to flush out the urinary tract. Otherwise, infections can creep up. Then you get into UTIs and kidney infections if it gets really bad, stuff like that. Secretions that kill or inhibit microorganisms, like stomach acid, for example, is one. Things that contain enzymes, antibodies. Pus is something like that. Mucus in your nose has a lot of enzymes and antibodies and stuff like that trap a lot of that stuff. We've got cells called phagocytes. Phagocytes are very large cells that attack and remove microorganisms. We've got two types of phagocytes. We've got macrophages, which are neutrophils and eosinophils. And these enter peripheral tissues to fight infection. So you get a cut, for example, or something like that. You're going to have neutrophils and eosinophils flood into these spaces. Eosinophils are also really important for fighting and releasing a bunch of different types of proteins, cytokines, other substances and stuff like that are really responsible for fighting specific types of bacteria, viruses. They seem to be pretty important in viral infections, as well as an important part of the inflammation process, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And then you have macrophages, which are large phagocytic cells derived from monocytes. Monocytes are found in your bone marrow, that are then distributed throughout the body in your bloodstream, for example. And these make up the monocyte macrophage system. And these are basically your these are your Pac-Man cells, right? And so these end up getting activated, and they will respond to pathogens in several different ways. One of the ways is they will engulf pathogens. They will bind to pathogen cells, like your neutrophils and eosinophils will do this, will bind to other cells and basically sacrifice themselves so they can be destroyed. There's another system called the complement system that these cells are a part of, and they will also destroy pathogens by releasing toxins around the pathogen in the interstitial fluids that attack the pathogens and destroy them. Otherwise, they circulate throughout your body, waiting to be activated by these other cells. Okay, so innate defense starts off with immune surveillance by these cells called NK cells. NK cells are natural killer cells, NK cells. And these are the ones that are going around looking for pathogens, cells that don't belong. Now, how it does this is by looking for cells that have specific antigens, right? So remember with the red blood cells, we talked about how your cells have identifying markers, right? Those are antigens. If your NK cells find cells, and basically they'll stick together just like they do in this picture right here, they will dock together. And if it doesn't recognize those antigens, then it stays there. If it recognizes the antigens, then it moves on. So basically, think of NK cells as kind of walking through the hallway, bumping into people, and if they recognize them, then they move about their business. And if they don't, they hold on to them and they start yelling, basically. And so what ends up happening is they recognize and stick to each other. And if it recognizes it as a pathogenic cell, an abnormal cell, then the Golgi apparatus realigns itself, right? So here it is right there. Then what happens is, here, let me just skip ahead. There we go. Okay, so then basically what we do is the Golgi apparatus secretes chemicals called perforins. And basically, this is the complement complex that I had mentioned. And so basically what happens is these perforins punch little holes in the cell membrane. You can see them right here. Basically, they sort of slot in place and they open up a hole in the cell membrane and they hold it open. And that basically just allows things to come in and start wrecking shop like enzymes, but it also allows stuff to leak out. And so then basically at this point, what ends up happening, I kind of had to skip ahead, but you have lysis of the cell, so it bursts because you've punched all these holes and stuff into it. It's basically like punching holes in a balloon, right? You punch a big enough hole in it, and then the whole thing pops. The cell membrane gets disrupted and stuff like that. Other surveillance includes looking for tumor-specific antigens. So your cancer cells, one of the things that makes them abnormal is their antigens are wrong, basically. They're a little bit off, but they're off just enough. And so the NK cells will recognize them as abnormal. Now, in some cancers, they can actually escape detection by the immune system. So they're abnormal, but they may have all the correct antigens on the outside, even though they're dividing much more rapidly at an uncontrolled rate, that sort of thing. Other cells that get infected with viruses. So basically, how viruses work is they attach to your cell, inject their own genetic material into your DNA. That material inserts itself in your DNA, and it utilizes your cell's own manufacturing processes, and it basically rewrites the instructions. So instead of making all the stuff that it needs for the cell, it starts making the stuff that is needed for the virus. And then eventually what happens is the virus fills up with the cell fills up with viral particles until it bursts, and then all those viruses leave to infect other cells and stuff like that. And so cells that are infected with these viruses have abnormal proteins on the plasma membranes. These are these abnormal markers. And so your NK cells identify and destroy them. Now, there are some acquired cells that also do this, which we'll talk about in the next video. We've got other structures known as cytokines. Those are chemical messengers released by tissue cells. Cytokines we talked about. There was when you get injured, when we talked about the blood clotting process. Cytokines trigger that process. Now, if some of the tissue cells also get infected, they will release these cells to trigger the immune response. Part of that immune response is your inflammation response, which I believe we talk about a little bit later. We've also got interferons, which are small proteins that trigger the production of antiviral proteins. They don't kill viruses. Antiviral proteins don't kill viruses, but they block replication in the cell. So they don't kill the viruses, but they do stop the hijacking, basically, of the cell's membranes. And interferons are a type of cytokine that are released by these tissue cells, specifically ones that are released by cells that have been infected. Okay, so the complement system, not only does it punch holes into the cell membranes, they assist antibodies in the destruction of pathogens. Antibodies are like special classes of proteins, basically, that sort of act like an immune surveillance, but they're associated with the acquired immune response. And they work together in cascades. So they stack up with each other, and as they stack up, they send out signals to bring in more proteins and stuff like that. Right. So effects of the complement activation, activating the complementary system. One of the effects is destruction of the cell by lysis, which we saw when we looked at the NK cells and the cellular surveillance, okay, and using those porphyrins to punch holes in that cell, right? Here's another picture of that right here, and that particular membrane attack complex is what that's called. All right, you can also have enhanced phagocytosis, also known as opsonization. So basically what ends up happening is special proteins called opsins are released and attached to pathogenic cells. This triggers the neutrophils that I had mentioned a couple of slides ago to come and eat these smaller pathogens. They're very good at what they do, and they can only be triggered during this process. Now, I kind of mentioned a little bit, so you may need to go back, about the activated phagocytes and the activated macrophages. That's kind of what's going on right here. So in addition to this, you can also have the inflammation response, which mast cells, which are a type of white blood cell, release histamines, which triggers this response. Now, something else that shows up in here that triggers this response are these basophils, which is another white blood cell that increases local inflammation, releasing chemical triggers to accelerate this process. This is also going to attract other white blood cells and other phagocytes, and it's going to accelerate blood flow, which is going to bring a lot of these white blood cells to this area a lot more quickly. And you'll also have a sort of buildup of this fluid. That's the actual inflammation that you feel, is buildup of fluid in these interstitial spaces. Speaking of inflammation, that's a localized tissue response to injury. Now, we looked at that with the clotting response a little bit. The clotting response and the inflammation response are very closely related to each other because they both occur because of injury. And it's triggered by anything that damages or destroys cells or tissues. Signs of inflammation is redness, swelling, heat, because you've got all that increased blood flow, as well as pain because you're putting pressure on surrounding tissues and stuff like that. Inflammation is good from a healing standpoint. It helps temporarily repair the injury by sort of closing it off. It also prevents pathogens from entering the wound. It slows the spread of pathogens to surrounding areas because of all that fluid that is trapped in that area, plus all those the white blood cells coming in, those immune cells coming in to fight those pathogens at that local area. And it also allows defenses to be mobilized locally, regionally, and systemically, which is throughout the entire body, to fight the pathogens and then begin regeneration, the repair process, that healing process, closing up that wound permanently. So there is a certain amount, like I said earlier, that there is some discussion about how some inflammation is healthy because it aids in healing, fighting infection, and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of debate back and forth about that. There's another similar one about fevers. Fevers have a very real purpose in the healing process. All right, so let's take a look at that process, that inflammation process that's part of your innate defense. So basically we start with some sort of tissue damage, for example. Other types of inflammation are going to be similar to this process. This one is just starting with tissue damage. That's the most likely place that pathogens are going to enter into your body, right? And so basically we have some sort of cut or something like that. And these tissues right here all get damaged. And that's going to release a flood of chemicals into the interstitial fluid around all those cells. These are some of those cytokines, right? And some of those other substances that we talked about with the blood clotting process about a month ago in the circulatory system unit, okay? So this is going to activate mast cells, which are special types of cells that sort of reside in the tissues and stuff like that. And those are full of histamine, which starts the inflammation response, as well as a substance known as heparin. And heparin begins the coagulation response, the blood clotting response. So from there, we have dilation of the blood vessels, which increases blood flow to the site, increases tissue flow, fluid flowing into the interstitial tissues. That's where the redness comes in because there's more blood, swelling because of increase of the tissue fluid, the interstitial fluid, heat because of all of that thermal energy that was being carried by the blood is now being brought to the site of injury, and pain because pressure is being put on this area. And this also makes you aware that there's some sort of injury there to try to take care of it. Then from there we have the clot formation right there, and then eventually that will close as the tissue repairs itself, as the cells grow back and stuff like that. This is also going to release a cascade of chemicals that attract phagocytes, primarily those neutrophils, and some eosinophils that we had mentioned earlier, I believe. These are going to start engulfing and removing debris, pathogens that have managed to make it into the wound, as well as other defense mechanisms, which will allow the cells around the injury to focus on repair. Eventually, as the cells grow back together, the clot starts to dissolve. The body doesn't have to devote precious resources to fighting infections. It can use those resources to rebuilding that torn, damaged area, and then that's your healing process. Other products of inflammation can be necrosis. If it takes you long, that is tissue death. At the site of the wound. Basically, any damaged cells and stuff like that around it will die off, allowing new cells to grow in their place. Pus formation, which is a mixture of a lot of different things, debris, things that have sort of entered into the wound, cell fragments and stuff like that, fluid, dead tissue, and stuff like that will basically get drained off, essentially, and isolated and drained off. We've also got, so if it continues, if an injury continues to build up pus and it can't get purged and we have continued cell death and things like that, that is an abscess. Now, I think there were a couple of groups that looked at abscesses as far as skin conditions are concerned. This is basically if the pus does not get removed somehow and it builds up, then we get into an abscess. Other innate defenses besides inflammation is fever, which is a body temperature greater than 99 degrees. Most doctors, especially like pediatricians, will say that you're not considered having a fever until it is 100 degrees or higher. That sort of allows for normal temperature fluctuations if you've just exerted yourself, if you're in a warm environment, stuff like that. But fevers actually have a very real purpose. They increase your metabolic rate. So basically everything's going to start working faster. That's going to accelerate your defenses, all those cells that are moving around and stuff like that. It also inhibits some viruses and bacterias because of the temperatures are too high. They're not able to function as efficiently as they normally would. And so there's some other debate, and I think I mentioned this earlier at some point, where a certain amount of fever is actually beneficial, or at least that's the debate that's concerned. If you've got low-grade fevers, there are some doctors that recommend you do not take anything to break that fever because you're inhibiting your body's natural ability to fight off that infection. The problem is fevers are uncomfortable. They can bring about aches and pains and overall not feeling well and stuff like that. So a lot of people try to take things like Tylenol, for example, to break that fever. And there are some doctors that recommend that as well. And so it's kind of interesting that there's some debate as far as, should we let a fever run unchecked as long as it doesn't get too high. I know there's a certain threshold. After about 102 or 103, people start to get a little nervous because then you're causing harm to your own cells. Fevers are triggered by substances known as pyrogens. These are produced by various pathogens that enter into the body that trigger the hypothalamus to raise your body temperature. If you remember from last semester, your hypothalamus, one of the things it does, it acts like a thermostat. So if your body temperature gets too low, it does the temperature increase feedback. Same thing if it gets too high. These pyrogens will trigger the hypothalamus to raise that thermostat, so your body starts accelerating. That's also why if you've ever had a fever, or when you have a fever, it's really common to feel chills, like you feel really cold, because now your body thinks it's too cold, so it's actively working to raise your temperature. And then once your fever breaks, all of a sudden you're roasting hot and you break out in sweat because now all of a sudden your body's like, we are truly too hot. We need to shed all this excess heat. So we're kind of wrapping up the innate defenses, and here is a helpful diagram. This is in the notes slides if you pull these. So I would definitely recommend taking these pictures and pulling them into your notes. But this lays out the different layers of physical defenses. We've got physical barriers like oil glands, sweat, skin, hair, stuff like that. Different phagocytes that all basically, they just go around and just eat things that aren't supposed to be there. We've got our immune surveillance with the NK cells, finding cells that don't belong, including cancer cells and abnormal your own abnormal body cells and stuff like that. Interferons, which prevent viruses from being able to hijack your cells and stuff like that. We've got the complement system, which basically all these proteins coming in and sort of working as a cascade and stacking on top of each other to pop these viruses and these pathogens like balloons and stuff like that. Inflammation process, and here it lays out our steps of the inflammation process again, so this is a really good one to write down if you want to succinct steps for the inflammation process. And then also fever and stuff like that. Regardless of if you've got strep throat, if you've got the flu, parasitic infections like malaria and stuff like that, you're going to have all of these same defenses. Okay, all of these are going to come into play to protecting your body in the same way against all pathogens. Now, good thing, innate defenses are fast. They activate and go to the affected area very, very quickly. However, since they're broad spectrum, their effectiveness is limited. We know, well, or we should know, you will know now, specialists are very, very good at a very small number of things. Generalists are pretty good at everything, but they're not the best, okay? So somebody can come in and be better at that one thing, right? And so your innate defenses, those are your generalists. They're pretty good at a lot of stuff, but they get outfoxed. And then this is where we get into our acquired immunity, or adaptive immunity. These are our specialists, which we'll get into in the next video. All right, well, I think that's it. If you need to go back and review any of this stuff, take the time to do that. I think it'll be well worth it. Make sure that you've gotten everything filled in on that note sheet that I had talked about at the beginning of the first video, and go back and fill in any spots that I haven't filled in right here. So far, we've got a few more cells that we're going to talk about in the next video with adaptive immunity. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email, send me a remind message, ask me in class, drop a comment below, ask me a question there. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing y'all again soon.
Guess what? I got a fever. And the only prescription is more cowbell.